quas quia Pygmalion aevum per crimen agentis viderat offensus vitiis quae plurimamenti feminae natura dedet, sine conjuge caelebs vivebat talamique diu consorte carebat. This month, the woman that we are going to be focusing on is Galatea. There are two Galateas in Greco-Roman mythology, but we are going to be focusing not on the one who has a relationship with the Cyclops, but instead the one who is a ivory statue. And her tale is told by Publius Ovidius Naso, the Roman poet known as Ovid. And we're going to be discussing really some pretty beautiful and interesting passages that mean something personal, both to Lauren and to me, using a framework of the sacred text.
Yeah, so we're also going to give to you a little short video that goes into the Lectio Divina process. That's what we're going to do. And it's interpreted in different ways, but we have a pretty kind of concrete formula that we're going to use. First, we'll give you just a super short summary of the story in English. So Pygmalion is a sculptor and he's pretty fed up with the women in his area. So he decides he's going to just be celibate and never get married. But he's a sculptor. So he works on fashioning little sculptures all the time. And one day he makes an ivory statue of a very beautiful woman. And it turns out she's so beautiful that he falls in love with the sculpture. Then
the festival day for Venus had come, and he goes to celebrate Venus and to beg Venus to give him a woman. He doesn't dare to say, to give me my statue as a woman, but instead a woman like my statue. And when he next sees the statue and touches the statue, the flesh of the statue sort of comes out of the ivory that it's been made out of and yields to his fingers. And and she becomes alive and eventually has a baby with him.
And that's like the version that we have in Ovid, right? It talks about how she comes to life and then it's like 9 moons later a baby comes. So I always, when I taught this story, I would be like, it's one of the two myths that actually has a happy ending. I think now when we read it, it's definitely a little bit more problematic, but in our minds, we have images of these paintings that existed. When are those paintings done? Like the 19th century?
Yeah.
In our minds, we have these paintings that were done in the 19th century that are interpretations of this story. And it feels like you want there to be a happy ending. Oh, Pygmalion and Galatea happily ever after. Madeline Miller's little novel takes a different approach to that story. And I think one in which is maybe in the reading and the interpretation could potentially be closer to what we would think of in modern terms of a woman coming to life and being in the situation that the statue Galatea was put in. So what we're going to do is that we're going to start our Lectio Divina process. We're each going to pick a line from the portion of the Metamorphoses that describes this story. And we'll talk about it literally, we'll talk about it symbolically, we'll talk about it personally, and then we'll talk about what it brings to mind for us to do as like an intention in the immediate future. So
Wonderful. Yeah, and if you're curious about what books we have The Lobe, which has Latin on one side, English on the other, that Lauren's looking at. And then I wrote my notes in the back of Stephanie McCarter's brilliant translation. And we hope that you'll join us at our event where she'll be speaking about the different factors that came into her translation of this very, as you said, very kind of controversial and often problematic, but also, beautifully told myth.
yeah.
So here we
and
are.
it's just for reference, if you want to follow along, we're book 10, about lines 243 is where the story starts.
What passage meant a lot to you?
So I'm going to read line 248. Sculpsit eber formamque dedet qua femina nasci. And then there's two words in the next line, nulla potest, that are kind of essential because the whole thing together means he sculpted an ivory statue and gave it a shape which no woman is able, which no woman born is able to replicate or to be, right? That's kind of left out. But the idea is that there's no other living woman who is as beautiful as this ivory sculpture that he has created, that he has made, sculpsit et dedit formam. And when I read that, I was super struck by the nasci, to be born, right? We get the word nascent from that verb. And we are just coming off of reading about Eve.
Mm-hmm.
And Eve was another woman who was not born, right? The
Yes.
Vulgate talks about how she's eduxit, how God leads her out of Adam's side. And I just thought about how we've got these women who we're talking about women, but like here are two women who haven't actually been born.
Totally. So like
Um,
in the classical tradition and in the biblical tradition, it's that same sort of like motif coming
yeah,
back.
yeah,
Yeah, and this is also the first time that we see abor used, right? The word for ivory.
yeah. And I became fixated on this word when we were at the MFA because we're taking a look at a variety of sculptures, and all of a sudden it hits me that ivory sculptures are typically pretty small, right? And we had the chance to very quickly talk to the curator for the ancient Roman stuff, and she was like, yeah, maybe there could be the potential for a larger ivory sculpture like the one that Phidias created, the Chryselephantine statue of Athena, which is long lost, but it's described as being golden and ivory, but it's pieces of ivory put
Mm-hmm.
together. Typically, a solid ivory sculpture is small.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole, so that totally changed my perspective on what Galatea would look like. And it really, I was imagining things very differently
Yeah.
from that line
And
on.
we're also probably really influenced by the art that came
Yes,
afterwards, in which she's life size.
right.
But actually, her, ivory to me feels fairly fragile, fairly small. And I think that that's
Hmm.
also like one of the ideals of womanhood, right? Is this
Mm,
idea of, being so petite and so, yeah, sort of weak that you
yeah.
can be easily controlled.
Right. Like handheld, little
Hmm.
mini-sized woman.
Cool. Okay, so that's the literal meaning, and then symbolic, the meditatio, is that sort of how we see women experience patriarchy?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when I was reading this, I was really struck by the fact that you've got this standard of a woman who isn't even able to be born, right? She's so
Hmm.
beautiful, like the beauty surpasses living humans.
Hmm.
And that really, it stuck with me because you've got, we experience that today,
Hmm.
right? In media, social media, or printed media, there are these images of women that are not real.
Hmm.
They're purposely created to give us this sense of um, an impossible standard that we're always striving to meet. And, this is something that Ovid knew in the first century AD, and that we're still experiencing it today. So that was
Absolutely.
really interesting.
Nice.
I think another symbolic thing that struck me is in the line above, he describes the sculpture as nueum, which is a bright white like snow. And that's another interesting concept
Hmm.
of beauty. Like even in the ancient world, thinking that things that were beautiful were a bright white. Which I think in
Hmm.
contrast to what we were just talking about has come a long way. So I
Hmm.
remember like we had, a J. Crew catalog, and most of the models were, white women, and like fairly light-skinned white women.
Hmm.
And now, if you look at catalogs, like you've got
Hmm.
a greater variety of different types of beauty. So even though, we sometimes have that impossible standard that we're still kind of
Hmm.
typically striving for, it's it's maybe a little bit more vast now.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's partly because I think women are at the table, right? It's not
Yeah,
just the Pygmalions deciding
right,
what beauty is.
right, right.
Nice. So, on a personal level, we have the oratio. Is this something that you feel like you can link to your own life in some way?
Yeah, so I think about I think about these things and I think about these concepts. I think about like if we're talking about beauty, we can talk about it as being broad,
Mhm.
right? We can talk about like if we're I liked to show images of words when I was teaching. And so if you're showing an image of what it means to be pulcare, what pulchritudo is, you can show different types of women. And so I think that, or different types of people, right? It doesn't even have to be
Mhm.
specific to women. So I think that's important. And I think this kind of goes into my intention as well, my invitatio, is I think as a mom, I don't have girls, but my brother has three little girls, and I do see the difference between how people like greet them or compliment them versus my boys. And I think being intentional in terms of, complimenting,
Mhm.
especially young women on things that aren't related to their
Yeah.
physicality and
Totally. So
like
that might even lead
beauty.
into like your invitatio, like an intention or a call that you're hoping to send into.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's exactly right. I think going forward, not only with young women, but also like any woman, like if I'm because I do. I mean, I like to like if
Mm.
you see somebody and like they're looking really good that day, be like, oh my God,
Yeah,
I love your outfit. You are killing it. But is there a way to connect that to something else?
totally.
Right? Like I love the way you put those colors together or something.
Yeah.
I don't know, like
Yeah, different
like yeah, a
quality.
different
Yeah,
facet of
for sure.
somebody's like life or personality rather than
Totally.
just their like physical beauty.
I think that's awesome. That's like a really great intention. And it's one that I think like I'm now inspired to do more too, you know?
And I think it's something that you can like we can do right away, right? It's not
Right.
like, oh, we have to wait to like
No,
try to
for
do
sure.
this.
For sure. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So your line is a little bit further down.
It is indeed. Looking at this is still in book 10, line 283 and 284.
You want to read those lines first?
Absolutely. Temptatum molescit ebur positoque rigore, subsidit digitis, cedit quod humatia sole. So what I'm really curious about is, seeing the different ways that this can be translated.
Mm,
Because I think that this is something where, there's such weighty language in
mm-hmm,
English around
mm-hmm,
consent, yielding, submission.
mm-hmm.
So what the line literally means is, he softens, or sorry, pardon me, the ivory softens at the touch,
Mm-hmm.
and with stiffness placed aside, it gives way to his fingers and it
Mm-hmm.
yields. So her own ivory is almost moving like wax, and it's
Mm-hmm.
compared in the next few lines to wax, the one that's been softened by a candle. And this just has so many implications. So like, yeah, I guess just to sort of reflect this structure of the Lectio Divina, the literal is that her body is slowly becoming pliant, right? To
This
his
is the
touch.
change, right?
This
This
is
is
the
like
transformation.
when we like Venus has interpreted his prayer in a very literal way.
Mhm.
And so she's like, I know what you want. I know.
Absolutely.
I've heard you before. You
Totally.
don't want something similist. You want your actual
Yeah,
statue to come alive.
exactly.
So this is where we
Exactly.
see that happening.
And then when it comes about with the symbolic part, that's where I think translations can be really influential, is
Yeah.
because like, is this something where she's yielding or she's giving way? Is she sort of losing herself in this process? Or is this something where she's coming into her own and actually like
Mm,
being born in some way? So I'm really curious to kind of look at those different ones. But ultimately, when we move through to the symbolism of this, I was struck by how many examples we have of women struggling with this very issue. So, like for
mhm.
example, Saint Brigid, Santa Brigida, she wrote her Revelations in the medieval period, and she talks about how a wife should be like cheese in a cheese mold to her husband. Not the
Oh.
sexiest thing that you could say in your marriage vows, but she says, "Tu autem sponsa mea debes esse quasi caseus, corpus tuum quasi formella, in
Mm,
qua caseus donec figuram formellae habuerent formabitur." So this whole idea of just like needing to mold to your husband's life,
mhm,
whether it's the pressure to give up your last name when you don't want to give up your last name,
mm,
or whether it's feeling as if you need to maybe get plastic surgery or put on makeup because society is expecting that of you in a way that it's not of the men in your life. I think Santa Brigida talks about that. We've got that here in the Pygmalion Galatea story, but then also like literally as recently as last night, and this is where we move into like the personal and the oratio part of this sacred text. Reading is last night I was at trivia, and one of the questions was, what word did Diana famously leave out of her marriage vow when she got married to King Charles, now King Charles?
Obey.
Obey, right? So even in very recent times, in the 1990s,
it was a big deal.
We're like negotiating, right? Or the ways that even still today, a lot of weddings will end with like, I now pronounce you man and wife instead of husband and wife. There's just this way in which wifehood is a huge shift, right? There's so many different ways in Latin to talk about virgin becoming wife, becoming mother. All of these are very coded, whereas with men it's not necessarily such a huge impact on their status in society. And so yeah, I think that when I think about the personal, I think about just like my own struggles to kind of sort of think outside of the box, which, to be honest, I came from a family that really fostered my independence and wanted me to think differently, wanted me to speak up for what I cared about individually. But I will say that I still struggle with that the difference between all of this messaging from society, right, that does have that idea of obeying or of a power differential, and then my
shaping.
Yeah, and then my own within my family, sort of understanding of my own integrity, self-sovereignty, all of these things. So when I think about what my invitatio could be or my intention, this is something very literal, but kind of like, as you were saying, it's nice to have something that you can apply starting today.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm getting a lot of messaging, not necessarily around gender things right now that I'm grappling with, but just like mass consumerism related to the holidays. Like it feels like every day I get new like junk mail catalogs being like, here's all this stuff that you need, gifts for everyone.
Emails. Yeah.
And I think like as awesome as it is to have, ways to support organizations on like Giving Tuesday, it's like after Thanksgiving, after Black Friday, after Cyber Monday, and then we're doing Giving Tuesday as like almost an afterthought. So I think I'm just going to really try to like resist the cheese mold or resist the like the digitus of society kind of telling me like the way that you celebrate the solstice or Christmas or any of the holidays that you want to celebrate has to be in the way that we say it is, when I actually want to be able to celebrate it without necessarily, wrapping my life in plastic, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think that that's probably my invitatio.
I love that. I'll probably put this like later, but because I'm obsessed, or like I'll put it in, I think, when it makes more sense. Can I call us back to temptatum molescit aber? So the ivory molescit, the ivory softens, and molescit comes like we get mollify. What's really interesting is that she at this point is still a statue.
Oh, yeah.
And so the transformation isn't immediate. It takes time. And what is disturbing and problematic is like the imagery around the fingers trying to work and shape and testing whether or not the Abor is alive or warm or, yields to his touch.
There's a lot of touching and fingers and yielding even way earlier in the poem that is really quite disturbing.
And I think that's what kind of can make this hard and what has made it problematic to read. I think some colleges have even kind of taken aspects of the Metamorphoses off of their reading list for portions like this. I think probably if you're in a college class, you can talk about these things pretty openly. But it just struck me as like interesting that by, in line 284, she's still Abor. And it does take a little while with the work of his own hands to find a body.
Yeah, she doesn't really show up until I think it's like 292 maybe is when it says Virgo, that she's actually Virgo
Right. Or she's
instead
not,
of,
she's no longer just like a corpus.
yeah.
Yeah.
Let's take just a little, let's take a look at some of the different translations of this passage. So you have,
I have a lobe with an English translation by Frank Justice Miller.
okay,
So your line is the ivory grew soft to his touch, and its hardness vanishing, gave and yielded beneath his fingers as Himation wax.
okay. And then here we have a different one by A.D. Melville, where it says, beneath his touch, the flesh grew soft, its ivory hardness vanishing. And what I was particularly excited was to see Stephanie McCarter's translation, where she says, the ivory grows soft, its hardness gone, and sinks beneath his fingers' touch like
Mhm.
wax. So in all of these, I really like to like at least just get a sense of, where's the agency in it? Because in the original, it's Abor, ivory,
Mhm.
molluscate. Ivory goes soft.
Right.
It's not necessarily saying that his fingers make her soft.
Right.
So there's a certain amount of honestly like compliance, right?
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
yielding or submission that she's experiencing in this very passage. And I think in this one, it's kind of interesting. With Melville, we have beneath his touch, the flesh grew soft, and flesh is not in this.
Right. I think that one's maybe a little less close. I think
Mm-hmm.
um both Madeline both Stephanie McCarter and this chap Frank Miller do a good job of being very literal. I particularly like the Stephanie McCarter's sinks beneath his
Mm-hmm.
fingers because the Latin does say subsidet
Right.
credit digitis, right? So
Cool.
sinks and yields to his fingers. So there is,
Mm-hmm.
I think she was able to capture both the poetry and the literal aspect
Mm-hmm.
of the text. And whereas
Yeah.
this is maybe just so like very, very literal.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear also like Stephanie McCarter talk about punctuation because there's so such scant
Right.
punctuation in the original, but in her she's got a lot of exclamation points. She's got a lot of dashes. There's sort of this like ecstasy in the moment
Oh,
that he's
interesting.
experiencing that while she's just softening and like
Right.
yielding,
Yeah.
that they're on such different pages.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Like you
Yeah.
have this like cold thing becoming like slowly and steadily warmer, but you have
Mm-hmm.
him like inflamed. And I mean, I think he's described that way as being
Totally.
um like very like hot with passion.
Yeah, just like the flame of the Venus, the
Right.
votive
Like going
flame.
back to the sacrifice that he made to Venus on her
Yeah.
altar. One of the things I want to say about this is like you're reading it, and if you have in your mind a life-size sculpture,
Mhm.
yes, this is disturbing and very icky.
Mhm.
But I think it's kind of weird and almost like Ovid is trolling Pygmalion to think of it as like a small ivory sculpture, right? Then it
Mhm.
becomes like, who is this weirdo who's obsessed with this like
Small. Yeah,
figurine? And
totally.
all of a sudden it's like,
But I also wonder if like, okay, just to sort of play devil's advocate, because like
totally.
you and I both very much relate to this story as women. I also
Hmm.
wonder though, like how artists relate to the story because we see these art pieces of
Hmm.
this tale, right?
Yep.
About this tale that are so lovingly and creatively done.
Yes.
And there is a long tradition of this idea of kind of like statues or inanimate objects becoming to life. Like
Yeah.
when you think like a Pinocchio or like, isn't like Thumbelina to a certain extent?
No idea.
I don't know. Like there's Frosty the Snowman, right? We get this. There is something sort of joyful to the idea of
Totally.
a sort of somewhat anthropomorphic creature that comes to life at your
Yeah.
touch.
Yeah.
I think the most challenging part of this is the fact that it maps so clearly onto women's actual reality, that's
Yeah.
where it becomes really tough, right? It's like nobody's actually out there like exploiting animate snowmen.
Yeah.
Right, but it's where it
I don't know
becomes
about
too
no
real.
one.
Where it becomes a little too real,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think. But I do think that we can imagine this story as something that's about the artist's relationship to their
Their
art.
work. Yeah.
There's a gorgeous passage in a Salman Rushdie novel. I can't remember which one, but where there's an artist who becomes so invested in his art that he actually starts spending more and more time in the actual canvas
Oh,
until one day
wild.
he can't come back.
Oh,
And so
cool.
he's just like frozen in his own painting because he's become so, I think it's actually kind of, we could see the Pygmalion story if we wanted
Yeah.
to as just a beautiful moment of like really fully investing in your art so much that it becomes your world.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that there's plenty of pushback against that though that I
Yeah.
personally have, but I just it's an additional way that you could read this, especially if you're looking into reading things through a sacred text lens. One way to
Hmm.
explore it might be between you and, your muse, or between you and
Right.
your creative path.
And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention like all the things that this particular story has inspired, right? I mean, My
Mhm.
Fair Lady is a story about a woman's transformation from this kind of like Cockney street urchin to this very
Mhm.
sophisticated lady. And there's been a lot of other
Yeah.
works that are kind of that there's been a lot of other works that kind of come and are shaped from this. So Madeline Miller's kind of reinterpretation of it being less ideal and less of a like happy ending is fascinating. It was
Totally.
really interesting to read.
I think that one of the really cool moments in Galatea is when Madeline Miller literally uses a direct line from the Ovid about how Pygmalion gives the statue little balls and like gifts and shells and all of that. And so when I saw that, I was just so grateful that I had read the Latin in
Yeah.
the original, because I was like, oh, I honestly know this, where she says, okay, on page 11, she says, he told me again how well he had cared for me, dressing me in silks and draping me in flowers and jewels and bringing me seashells and gold-colored balls and praying to the goddess every night. And
Right.
we literally see that in the actual Latin, where we're talking about,
Yeah.
here goes, he offers presents. He often offers munera grata, gifts that are appreciated by puellis, by girls. This is line 260. Munera fert illi concas terratesque lapilos et parvas volucres et flores mille colorum et liliaque pictasque pilas et ab arbore lapsas heliadum lacrimas. Or not quoque vestibus artus dat digitis gemas. I mean, it just goes
Yeah,
on.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
draping her in all of these jewels, but literally
Yeah.
the exact passage that she took. And I think that, in a world in which Latin is an ever-aging language,
Yeah.
this is really the power of it, is to be able to see the depth of knowledge that Madeline Miller
Right.
brings to her
Yeah.
telling while
Yeah.
also retelling it.
Yeah. Well, she's a brown classicist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great.
Do we want to say anything else?
Let's do this.
I love this.
Yeah, this was so amazing. I think thank you so much for bringing the reading as a sacred text to practice, and I think we should do this again for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, well,
Well,
late.
late.